Okay, we are back for part three of this kind of introduction to apologetics series. So today we're going to be looking at kind of taking a step back from last week. Last week was all about the evidence for Jesus and the resurrection. To open this up, the famous theologian A.W. Tozer once said, "What comes into your mind when you think about God is the most important thing about you." So what does come into your mind? Maybe you think about kind of the ancient paintings, a large bearded man in the sky, and maybe it's some really dramatic old kind of painting idea. Or maybe you're a little bit different. Maybe your idea of God is a giant floating mass of spaghetti noodles with a couple of eyes and two giant meatballs right in the center. This is a real thing. Yes, this is what is commonly referred to as the Flying Spaghetti Monster, and the religion around it, the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster, often referred to as Pastafarians, they believe that that their god is this flying spaghetti monster who created everything and is active. They are very big on pirates for some reason. They're some of the few that actively celebrate Talk Like a Pirate Day. They tend to wear colanders on their heads for things like DMV and wedding photos. And yeah, while this is a officially recognized religion in many places, as you can probably tell, it's parody. It's meant to be a satire on Christianity. It really started coming up several years ago in some conversations around like the teaching of evolution versus creationism in schools. And the way this was presented, it was essentially, okay, if you're going to have your God represented in education, whether in school or maybe like having the Ten Commandments in a courthouse, you need to represent my religion too. Ultimately making the point that your whole religious thing is just an outdated superstition. No more reasonable than a flying spaghetti monster. Frankly, of all the ways that Christianity's been parodied and satired over the years, this is probably my favorite. They bring me great joy, but it's it's not actually a religion. It's looking at Christianity and saying, you're being ridiculous. So, are they wrong? Is Christianity little more than an outdated superstition at this point? Are we holding on to kind of an ancient fable and trying to be taken seriously because of it? Are we believing in something that just is not there and we need to kind of grow up in a sense? This all kind of centers around the philosophical idea of naturalism. It goes by a few different names. You might hear naturalism, materialism, and it's ultimately just this idea that everything that exists is physical. Like everything arises from natural properties. There's no supernatural or spiritual explanations for anything. And this can appear in a few different ways. You might see this in a very kind of overall sense, the actual belief that there is nothing more than this. I think about like the scene in the first Doctor Strange movie where he goes on this rant about how, we are matter and nothing more, and then quite literally gets like punched into another dimension. It's a fun little moment in a mainstream Marvel movie that kind of makes this point in an interesting way. But so you have that view that like it's an actual internal belief that there is nothing more than the physical. You also see this in what might be called a methodological naturalism. This is where, say, you might believe in the supernatural and that there is a God and spirituality and all that, but you're not going to act like it, at least in the workplace. Like maybe you go to church on Sundays, but when you go to your job as a historian or a scientist or a philosopher, you're not going to appeal to God for any of these things. And so that is where we kind of get the variations on that, because a lot of it centers on this idea that miracles are just not rational. Miracles are impossible. I mean, you as the Christian, you're saying you believe in virgin births, talking snakes, walking on water, resurrections. Really? Are you really willing to say that these things happened? Can you be a rational human being and believe in things like this? Well, that's what we're here to figure out. We're kind of wrestling with the question today of, does God exist and are miracles possible? You'll see in a minute those two things are very interrelated to each other. Because last week we talked all about Jesus and the resurrection. And I said towards the end of that we are operating under a fundamental assumption that there is a God who can perform miracles. Like, that's a big assumption to build your case on. It was very important for, like, the arguments around the historicity of Jesus do partially depend on that assumption, but we didn't actually defend that. So today we're going to actually examine, is there evidence to believe that that is possible, that that is true? And what we're going to see ultimately is that though if there is a God, then most other things are on the table. I don't know for sure if he was the first one to say it. I at the very least attribute it to him, but Dr. Frank Turek, I recall saying, if Genesis 1:1 is true, everything else is at least possible. Genesis 1:1, this idea that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and it goes on talking about basically him speaking the earth into existence and the universe into existence. All of this is created by God. And we need to reckon that if that is true, if there is a God who is powerful enough to create all of this, all of the individual little miracles that we read about in the Bible, or maybe talk about today, things like virgin births and resurrections, it's kind of small by comparison. If there is a God who can create everything, if God said, "Let there be light," and there was light, then all the other miracles are at least on the table. We can't just dismiss them as out of hand and irrational. The theologian Greg Bahnsen said it this way: the denial of the very possibility of miracles is not a piece of evidence for rejecting the Christian worldview, but simply a specific manifestation of that very rejection. So essentially his point is, you don't really use, like, the irrationality of miracles as evidence against Christianity. That's more of a consequence of you not believing in Christianity. You could, even outside of Christianity, just theism in general, rejecting the whole concept of miracles, that doesn't follow from science. That follows from your rejection of theism. And you'll see what I mean. But I think I go into this conversation with a certain sense of humility. I tend to open a lot of my talks when I'm speaking with people by kind of shooting my credibility in the foot a little bit, just acknowledging I am not a pastor, not a theologian. I don't have a degree in any kind of ministry type of thing. I only have a degree in communication studies. In the same way, I also am not a historian, I'm not a philosopher, I'm not a scientist. And today, more than most other sessions, I very much want to put it out there, I am not a professional scientist. It has never been my forte. I am very much relying on other people much smarter than me who have looked into this more thoroughly. Now, I feel pretty confident in the case I am making and presenting, and that it is rational, and I have a lot of people to back that up. But just to say, don't take this on my authority. Because this is a subject, I think, even more than history, philosophy, take your subject of choice. Science, we tend to very, very often rely on the experts. Like, we are not willing to make a statement for ourselves. We have to rely on the experts. And I bring this up now just to say we need to be cautious with that. We need to be cautious with understanding whether or not science actually says anything and whether scientists do. Let me appeal to Dr. John Lennox here. John Lennox, he is a Christian theologian, but he's also at least has been a professor emeritus at Oxford University in mathematics. This guy is very intelligent, knows his stuff, has spent a lot of time studying this, and he kind of broke it down in an interesting way, saying this: nonsense remains nonsense, even when talked by world-famous scientists. And goes on to say later on, any statement, whether made by a scientist or not, should be open to logical analysis. Immense prestige and authority does not compensate for faulty logic. And I want to have that idea in the back of your minds as we are going through these issues today, and really in life in general. Just because someone has a degree in a particular subject does not mean they are infallible, does not mean they have no bias, does not mean they are free from making illogical conclusions. Just because someone is way smarter than me in a particular field does not mean they cannot make mistakes, and we need to be ready to identify that. So that all kind of hinges on, as we set this up, what is a miracle? What is a miracle? Because a lot of people, I think, go in with the assumption that a miracle is like breaking the laws of physics and reality. And they cannot believe that happens. And there's a certain kernel of truth to that, but I think take a step back and consider the question is not whether or not the laws of physics can be broken. The question is whether or not there is someone powerful enough to do that. What is a miracle? The Christian would say a miracle is God intervening into the natural world, doing something that might not normally happen. That could mean breaking some laws, but not necessarily. If I take a pen and I drop it, the laws of gravity mean that that pen is going to fall. However, if I catch that pen in midair, I have stopped it from falling. I have, in a sense, broken that law from happening as it would naturally because I am a more powerful force. I was more powerful than the force of gravity on that specific pen. So the Christian is not saying that, oh yeah, the laws of physics are always being broken. We're saying that there is a more powerful force, in this case God, who can intervene and change things at will. The question is not, are miracles possible? The question is there a God powerful enough to perform miracles? Like I said, if Genesis 1:1 is true, everything else is at least on the table. We can't just reject it out of hand. So, what would that look like? How would we know that? Can we actually provide evidence that this exists? Because you do pretty often see the claim there is no evidence for God. You can't provide evidence for this God. So today we're going to be primarily focusing on, is there evidence for God? Because if there is truly evidence that God exists, there's good reason to believe that's true, then miracles are possible. And if miracles are possible, it makes it a little bit easier to kind of actually take in what the Bible tells us about things like resurrections. It's like, if that is at least possible, we need to consider what is the evidence that this particular resurrection may have happened. So, I'm going to provide two primary arguments in favor of God's existence. And there's a lot of evidence within those arguments, but these are two of the big ones. We'll get into a third one next week that will be more relevant to that topic. And there are others, but I think these are some of the strongest, and just they tend to resonate pretty well with people. Now, you'll notice as we get into these are not necessarily specific to Christianity. These are arguments that are purely for theism in general, that there is a God. So, these do not get you to Christianity specifically, but they at least open the door for it being possible. And that's why last week we focused so much on Jesus and Christianity specifically. But this first evidence and argument I want to get to is what is commonly referred to, well, maybe not commonly, it's a little bit of a scary name to be honest. It's sometimes referred to as the Kalam cosmological argument. It's been really popularized with that name specifically by guys like Dr. William Lane Craig. And I believe the Kalam, where the name comes from, is actually a ancient Muslim philosopher. So, just to say, like, they tend to use these same arguments as well in favor of there being a God. But this, don't get freaked out by the name. You've probably heard this before in some capacity. Sometimes the cosmological argument, sometimes just it's the argument from a beginning. The argument goes like this. You have two premises and a conclusion. The major premise, the big one, everything that begins to exist has a cause. So things don't just pop into existence out of nothing. The minor premise, the second part, the universe began to exist. So moving from a broad general term to a specific one. Therefore, our conclusion, the universe has a cause. If everything that begins has a cause, and the universe began, something or someone had to cause it. That is the Kalam cosmological argument. Doesn't make any direct claim about that being God specifically, or even that being the Christian God specifically, but that the universe has a cause. But what do we do with that? Well, this is a logical argument. Let's examine these premises. So, which of these is kind of controversial? So the first premise is probably the less controversial of the two, that everything that begins to exist has a cause. Usually we're pretty we're pretty agreed upon on that one. Like, that resonates with all of our anecdotal experiences. No one's ever experienced something coming into from nothing. However, there is some debate on this subject. So one of the more prominent voices on that issue is guys like Dr. Lawrence Krauss. He's a very famous astrophysicist, and I believe University of Arizona. He's written some work on whether or not there could be something from nothing. Specifically, he wrote this book, A Universe from Nothing, that is applying his scientific study around quantum physics and quantum vacuum and how that can be unstable. Basically, he's saying that a universe could come from nothing in the sense of a quantum vacuum, where that kind of what we would see as nothing, that kind of physically nothing, can still have enough instability to lead to something. That's his argument. However, as Dr. Craig pointed out on a debate with him, a quantum vacuum is thus far from nothing, and vacuum fluctuations do not constitute an exception to the principle that whatever begins to exist has a cause. So essentially, what we are seeing is Dr. Krauss taking his scientific expertise, which I do not want to undervalue by any means, but he's taking it a step outside of his lane into theology. He's saying that because of his study on quantum vacuum, therefore all of our questions around the beginning of the universe, we have an explanation, when that doesn't really follow. Because what he is describing as nothing is not actually nothing. He's redefined nothing as, at least in some capacity, something to make this point. I hope you can see the issue there. There's a really funny clip of him actually on the Colbert Report several years ago, and Stephen Colbert does a great job of just kind of poking at him a little bit, raising these. It's but that's something. That's not nothing. And it just gets to the point of, yeah, he is a brilliant scientist, but that doesn't mean his argument is logical and without bias. And this guy absolutely, he is one of the more staunch atheists out there. He's done debates. Not to speak poorly of a man, but his debates are really terrible. I do not enjoy watching him debate. He's extremely condescending and interrupting constantly. There's better debates to watch than his. But just to say, he's going in with that lens and bias, and it's clearly coloring the argument. So things don't generally just pop into existence from nothing. There's not good evidence to support that. But did the universe have a beginning? That second premise that we get into, did the universe have a beginning? This has been a little bit more hotly debated over the centuries. However, more and more, it seems that the evidence piles up that there had to be a beginning. We see this both scientifically and philosophically, but what are some of the scientific evidences for a beginning? Well, one of the first is the discovery of the expansion of the universe. By all accounts, our universe is not just stagnant. And the alternative to the universe having a beginning is it's always been there. The universe is kind of an eternal being, or in a sense. Or an eternal entity would be a better term. And if that's the case, and we're seeing it expand, that's a little weird. Because that would mean it's been expanding forever. But if it's always been there, where is it expanding from? Where was its starting point? It can't have one if it's always been there. So it has to have a beginning point that it's expanding from, just logically and scientifically, yeah. But there's been other discoveries as well, like the cosmic background radiation. This was discovered in the 20th century, and they were picking up on a certain amount of interference on their equipment. And initially they thought there was something wrong with the equipment, but they determined, no, it was tuned in such a way that they were determining what has now been dubbed cosmic background radiation. And what is theorized is that this is essentially leftover fallout from the Big Bang, from the beginning of the universe. Like with any massive explosion, you think about any kind of nuclear explosion that's happened, there's always radiation and fallout after the fact, right? That lingers around for a really long time. And so if the universe began with this massive explosion, it follows then that there would still be some fallout, some radiation left over from that. And the theory is that this is exactly that. Now, if their universe had no beginning, what is this then? There needs to be some other explanation, and you can't have a eternal universe if there was a singular beginning where everything exploded. Doesn't really work. There's also just the second law of thermodynamics. Just the scientific law that we have is that things generally don't go like better. Things go downhill. You don't go from cold to hot, you go from hot to cold. Energy slows down over time. It doesn't just keep on getting stronger and better. But if that's the case, and that if the evidence all supports that, why are we still here? If things are on a constant downward trajectory and we've been here since for all eternity, we should have run out a long time ago. We shouldn't still be here if it's an eternal thing. But that we're still here means that there was a beginning. Our time here is finite, not just as humans, but as an entire universe. And if that time is finite, but it's eternal, it doesn't work. It scientifically and logically does not work. And one of the prominent things related to this actually comes from Einstein's general theory of relativity. He was one of the ones to kind of help discover this motion and movement in the movement of the universe. And he initially wasn't too happy about that. It essentially happened that Einstein fixed the numbers. He rigged his own theories because he did not want to believe that the universe was expanding and therefore had a beginning. He believed in a eternal universe at that point. He later very much fixed that and listed that as one of his greatest errors or mistakes he ever made. But just to say, if even someone as brilliant as Albert Einstein is still subject to his own bias and making errors like that, we need to very much hold people accountable in these areas. We need to be willing to admit a scientist is not infallible. All of that just to say, the scientific evidence definitely points to the universe having a beginning. Doesn't mean every single scientist is convinced of that, and there's still a lot of speculations about could it be expanding and then contracting in this never-ending cycle. People are looking for evidence for that, but where we are now, the evidence points to a beginning. But even outside of science, scientific discoveries and changes are made all the time. Is there more to this evidence than that? Well, yes. Philosophically speaking, an eternal universe is logically absurd. It does not work. To represent this, let me use a fairly common example or story that illustrates the point. It's commonly referred to as Hilbert's Hotel or the Grand Hilbert Hotel. Now this is probably gonna make your head hurt. It definitely makes mine hurt. It deals with the absurdity of an infinity. So imagine you have a hotel, this Grand Hilbert Hotel. It's so big, in fact, it has an infinite number of rooms. So infinite number of rooms. And every single one is filled. There's no vacancy in the Hilbert Hotel. But someone comes in and they want to check into the Hilbert Hotel. They want a room, but there's no vacancies. But the concierge has an idea. I know what I'll do. I will move everyone in their rooms forward one. So the person in room number 1, you move into room number 2. Number 2, you move into 3. Number 3, you move into 4, and so on, all the way. And because you have an infinite number of rooms, there's still room. So by doing that, you've opened up room number 1, and then you have the person who can stay there. You have a lot of people come in, you keep on doing that, and you can do all kinds of weird, multiplications of things. But we recognize that doesn't actually make sense. For one, you can't have actually, an infinite number of rooms filled, and it gets into just the logic of numbers. It makes for an interesting math equation, but it doesn't work in a practical reality, especially going backwards. Maybe it would it works fine to say that there's a starting point that will go on for infinity, because then you'll never actually reach infinity. But to say that you go backwards and we've been around for infinity, that doesn't work, because that's when you get into things like the universe expanding or lots of thermodynamics. If we've been here since the beginning, you can't really reach a present moment. If your head hurts, I understand, so does mine. There's people much smarter than I that can probably explain this better as well. Look up some videos explaining the Hilbert's Hotel, and you'll see just how elaborate this equation gets. But if you place that into a physical reality, everything breaks apart. It's logically absurd. You cannot reach an infinity like an eternal universe would claim to be doing. So, if the universe had a cause, those premises all hold strong. There's no evidence. Their evidence seems to indicate that everything that begins to exist has a cause. And if that's the case, the universe also had a cause. Therefore, something caused the universe. So again, that doesn't mean God. However, we have to raise the question, if the universe has a cause, what caused it? What would be capable of doing this? What can we kind of infer about a cause of a universe? Well, the cause of the universe, it would have to be spaceless. It'd have to be outside of space, because we're talking about the creation of space. The universe is space. It would have to be timeless. It would have to be outside of time, because creation of the universe is not just creation of space. It's the creation of time, the beginning of time itself. So outside of space, outside of time, immaterial. This thing could not be a physical thing because this is the creation of space. That's actually one of the relevant things about like the flying spaghetti monsters, or even like ancient Greek mythologies and whatnot, is they're usually talking about a material being inside the universe, just somewhere far away. God is spirit, immaterial, outside of matter. They'd have to be powerful. Anything powerful enough to create the universe obviously needs an immense amount of power. And lastly, they would need to be personal, because of this is clearly a conscious decision. And a random entity cannot make a conscious decision like that. It would be operating on like instinct or rules or principles, not, okay, now it is time to create a universe, speaking that in a way. There's a debate I once watched. It was where Peter Atkins, I believe it was also with William Lane Craig, Peter Atkins, another notable atheist, and he was kind of pushing back on this objection of like the Kalam argument, basically saying, why does it have to be God? Why couldn't it just be like a computer? And, well, Craig would basically say, well, it has to be spaceless. Well, this computer is spaceless. It'll be outside of time. This computer is outside of time. It have to be personal. Well, my computer is very personal. Well, then your computer is God. Like, if you line up these characteristics, yeah, you might say it's something else, but ultimately you're describing basically what has to be God. I've heard some say in kind of a comedic context the whole idea of like simulation theory. The idea that our entire universe is just a computer simulation on some computer somewhere. And I've heard people jokingly say, so you're basically saying you believe in God, you just think he's a nerd. Because you're still believing there is someone outside of this space and time and matter and is very powerful to control everything within that and is a personal being. You just think it's something more. So that simulation theory is a whole other can of worms I won't get into, but just to say, when you lay out these characteristics, you describe God. Now, there is an aspect of this that some people get a little bit uncomfortable with. In Christianity, there's kind of a notion that the Big Bang is like the secular alternative to Christianity. It's like God creating or the Big Bang. And that's not really the case. The Big Bang is consistent with the Christian worldview. And I feel bad for saying this in the first place, but this is something from Greg Kokel. And I guarantee, as much as I might regret saying it, if you remember nothing else from this talk, you'll remember this. The way he says it is, a Big Bang requires a Big Banger. The Christian can believe in the Big Bang, we just know who banged it. Sounds a little odd, but the point is solid. What is the cause of the Big Bang? We would say that is God. The skeptic doesn't have an explanation for how the Big Bang came about. So we would just say that, yeah, Genesis describes God creating everything. Maybe he did so through a initial giant explosion. Let there be light. It's not inconsistent with the text of Scripture, is all that I'm saying. Now, there's another follow-up question that sometimes gets asked. If we are going to say, like, everything that begins to exist has a cause and God created everything, then, well, who created God? Isn't that inconsistent to say that, God has no source or no creation? And while I do understand the objection, it's missing the point. The entire idea of that argument is everything that begins to exist. Notice that word begins. That implies we are in time. Everything that begins in a chronological sense must have a cause. But we just said this God would have to be timeless. So everything that exists has to come back to that uncaused first cause. Sooner or later, you need to push back far enough to get to that uncaused first cause. And we are saying that would be God. So yeah, you could say something created God, but okay, then that would then be God. So that would be, the uncaused first cause. So sooner or later you get to that uncaused first cause, and that has to be God. So that's the Kalam cosmological argument. The argument from a beginning seems pretty reasonable to think that there is a God, or at least something along those lines. But what about a different argument? Another one that tends to come up is what's often referred to as like the fine-tuning argument. And this is the idea that life and the universe itself appears to be very, very precisely designed with particular conditions to allow us to exist. Like, by all accounts, we should not be here. Logically speaking and like evidentially, everything appears really, really precise in a way that if this was entirely random, we shouldn't be here. This shouldn't have worked out exactly the way it did. Because remember, everything that begins to exist has a cause, and that cause is either something or nothing. We would argue that that is something. And if it's not something, that means it's nothing. It also means it's random. It came about through random chance. And there is an awful lot of precise design for this to appear entirely random. Let's look at a few different areas. First is simply biology. The thing with like Darwinian evolution, and again, I'm not making a claim about the truth or falseness of evolution in general here, but back in Darwin's day, when he was first kind of designing this theory, they didn't know as much as we do now about single-celled organisms. There was kind of the notion that a simple organism was simple, and you could get that fairly easily. There's been a lot of speculation over the last, however many centuries over what that might have come from. And especially in the last century, like, did this come from the ocean? Did this come from space even? And all the theories don't really seem to line up. There isn't a consistent great option as to where life could come from in the first place. Because life is really, really complex. Even the most basic life form has so many moving parts that don't and really couldn't just come about entirely randomly. And even outside of a single-celled organism, think about something like DNA. It takes very little to go wrong for an organism just to not function, to be dead. And one of the ways that can all kind of work out properly is DNA. DNA is essentially code. Like, if you've ever worked with any kind of computer code, it takes very little for it to go wrong. A slight change and the whole thing breaks and you need to go in and fix it. And DNA is essentially the most complex computer code we have ever seen. It's a simple, force structure language, but it's so incredibly detailed and precise that that's how we are what we are. And a very minute change in that structure results in major changes and often death. And to say that came out entirely randomly, if you're looking at computer code, it cannot function with even slight changes. And we're saying that came about by chance, entirely randomly? There's an old saying about you stick a monkey in a room with a typewriter. If you leave it for a long enough time, it'll eventually bang on the keyboard and type out Shakespeare. That's kind of what the skeptic is appealing to here. That this super incredibly complex code was just enough time hashed out randomly. And we'll get more a bit is that reasonable to think? At the very least, this coming about entirely by random chance is a lot. It is a very, very complex process to say that came about just random chance. Okay. But set aside biology for a second. Let's talk about the Earth, the Earth itself. So a few factors to consider. The Earth's position with the sun is very, very important for things like our ability to have a water cycle. You change things just a little bit in how close we are to the sun, and water cycle isn't possible. We're in what is sometimes referred to as the Goldilocks zone. The not too cold, not too hot, we're just right. Because a slight change in that, or a slight change in like the tilt of the Earth, like how we're angled kind of in that position to the sun in its orbit, slight change in that, our climate becomes impossible. If the rotation was slightly different, our days and nights would be completely off. Nights would be too cold, or days would be too hot. You'd have more extreme wind speeds, and it would make things way more destructive and, frankly, make life generally not possible. Slight changes like that matter a lot. Or what about the Earth's crust? The Earth's crust, that the layer that we are on, its particular composure is also incredibly important. Think about things like earthquakes. Like, earthquakes are incredibly destructive. They're very dangerous. But without the layout we have of tectonic plates, life would not be possible on Earth. A thicker crust would negatively impact things like the quantity of oxygen we have. A thinner crust would lead to more destructive, like volcanic activity, and the tectonic plates just would not be able to have the stability we need. It seems like the seismic activity we have is kind of, again, Goldilocks zone, just right to make life possible without completely destroying all life in the process. What about the atmosphere? Earth's atmosphere, kind of that layer well above there, is partially dependent on gravity. And if Earth's gravity was just a little bit stronger, the atmosphere would have too much like methane and ammonia, other chemicals that would make life here impossible. It would make if the gravity was weaker, we wouldn't be able to retain the water we have. Our water cycle would be completely different, and there wouldn't be the amount we need for life. There wouldn't be the sufficient rainfall to support humanity. What about the moon? The moon, also very important for life because it's just the right size to keep our orbit stable. If it was a little bit bigger, a little bit smaller, Earth would not have quite the same stability it does in its rotation around the sun. And if that isn't the case, you go back to what we said with the position of the sun, life becomes impossible pretty quickly. And these are just a few of the factors that lead us to believe, like, okay, this seems intentional. You change any one of these little things and life becomes impossible. But take it even away from the Earth. Look at the universe itself. Factors like gravity, the particular numbers and rate that gravity happens, you change that slightly, the universe itself can't exist. Like, the particular particles and structures would not be possible without the way gravity is very precisely fine-tuned. Or we talked about the expansion of the universe. If the expansion of the universe was happening slightly faster or slightly slower, it would affect things like gravity and ability for kind of particles to maintain themselves. These are a couple of what we would call the fundamental constants and quantities of the universe, which, if anything, you see people lay out the numbers for this. Like, if things were changed by things like 1 to the 10 to the 90th power kind of thing, which numbers so incredibly precise, we can't even comprehend them. You see analogies like, if you were to cover the entire Earth in dimes and stack those dimes to the moon, and there's one single dime that is painted red, the chances of this happening entirely by chance is you picking that one dime out while blindfolded. That's the kind of numbers we get into, like incomprehensibly precise numbers. And to say that this came about by chance, it's just not reasonable. Is it possible? Yes, anything is possible. Anything is certainly on the table. But if we are going to make the best inference from the evidence, that is not it. I'm sorry, it's just not the most logical possibility. That might seem like a bold claim coming from a non-scientific Christian guy, but I'm not the only one saying this. Think about someone like Stephen Hawking, one of the most brilliant scientists of the last century, and he said, "The remarkable fact is, the values of these numbers seem to have been finely adjusted to make possible the development of life." He's not a Christian. He's not believing that this actually is there is a God fine-tuning things, but he's at the very least saying this looks odd. It looks like it has been adjusted, and is trying to find explanations for that. Another one, Fred Hoyle, another not a Christian, but he really kind of was onto something here when he said, a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics as well as with chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The numbers one calculates from the facts seem to me so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question. So his conclusion was not that there is a God who created everything, but he struggled to make sense of that detail. I believe his conclusion was actually to kind of go against the idea of like a beginning of the universe and things coming into existence without a cause. Like, he was a bit controversial for that, but just to say he acknowledged this doesn't make sense. Something has monkeyed with this. So with that in mind, like, okay, what are the possible explanations? Because, okay, so someone might say, yeah, but that doesn't necessarily mean a God made it. And like I said, a lot of these guys didn't think that. So what are the possibilities? What can we appeal to as possible explanations for this fine-tuning? The first would be necessity. Necessity meaning, like, is there some kind of like law of physics that made it so it had to be this way? Or maybe, like, is there, like, yeah, it looks like it's finely tuned in hindsight, but ultimately this is always inevitably how it was going to happen. The problem here really is just there's no evidence to think that. In fact, it really feels quite the opposite. It feels really quite like there's no reason to think it should have happened the way it did. All evidence points to, we should not exist. It should not look this way, and yet it does. There's not a law that's been discovered for, oh, this is the Rube Goldberg machine did have a reason behind it. So if it's not necessity, if there's no evidence to think that, could it be chance? Like I said, you add the chance question and give it enough time, it's possible, but so incredibly unlikely that it really is not a reasonable conclusion. All we're really left with after that is design. If there's no reason to think that it had to be the way it is, and there's no reason to think it probably came about randomly, again, from nothing rather than from something, all we're left with is something or someone designed this. Except there's one other alternative that skeptics appeal to. One other possibility. That's a multiverse. Not that kind of multiverse, though. I mean, kind of that kind of multiverse. Simply the idea of, if you have an infinite number of universes, and there's just so many universes where every possibility has occurred, it doesn't really matter if we have that, like, fine-tuning precise thing. We happen to be in one, maybe the one or one of the only universes where everything lined up perfectly. And so we got lucky, basically. And it's an interesting idea. Makes for great science fiction stories. Love that. But few problems. One, there's no evidence that it actually exists. Or at least very little. It's mostly like very speculative and theoretical. There's no evidence that it exists in this particular way. But even if it did, okay, say we had irrefutable evidence that a multiverse existed. That still doesn't actually solve the fine-tuning problem. It kicks it back a step, because then we're left with the question, well, what's making this multiverse? Do we have some kind of multiverse generator that is cranking these out? And is that personal? Is that powerful? Is it timeless, spaceless, immaterial? Is our multiverse generator perhaps a god? Or is it such a precise thing that it needed to be designed by a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, and so on and so forth? Like, it kicks the can back a step, but doesn't actually get you out of the overall issue of fine-tuning. This is, like I mentioned, the monkeys typing Shakespeare, right? And this is usually how people get around that, because some will say that, oh, you just have enough time and you have billions of years. And frankly, billions of years is not enough time. You do the math on kind of the random chance on things like DNA, things like the fundamental constants of the universe, of which there are many I didn't even get into. And frankly, you're going to reach the heat death of the universe well before you've most likely hit that chance. Possible, yes. Reasonable, no. The multiverse is their way of getting around that of if you just have an infinite number of chances, the time question doesn't matter either. But is there any reason to think there is a multiverse? And if so, does it really solve the problem? Doesn't seem like it. Now, there's a common response, a common critique of this argument that usually comes up now, commonly referred to as the God of the gaps. Basically saying, you as the Christian, all you're saying is, we don't know, so God did it. You have a gap in your knowledge, and you just stick God into it to solve your problem. I'm sympathetic to this, and I can see how they come to that conclusion, but it's a bit of a misunderstanding. Because they're saying basically, they're basically saying, let science run its course. Give it time to answer these questions. For the longest time, we thought, lightning just came from Zeus or Thor, and it was all a superstition. But over time, we learned how science works and how nature works, and we'll get there with these issues as well. So don't just stick God into the gap. Let science do its thing. Few problems here. One, we're not just filling gaps in knowledge, because these are things that, by all accounts, science is not equipped to handle. Like, it's not to say, well, we don't know it yet, but it seems like we'll figure it out. All evidence points to science not being able to answer these questions and us needing to appeal to something more like a God. We're not making there's no evidence, therefore God. We're saying there's positive evidence here that there is a God as the best explanation for all of this evidence, the united kind of Occam's razor best evidence for all of these things. But also, that's kind of assuming something will be discovered later when we don't know that. If we have to make a decision based on what we have right now, what is the best explanation? Yeah, we can hope and think maybe someday more evidence will, change our perspective on this, but we can't guarantee that. So if we have to make a decision on fundamental things like the nature of God right now, we can't really assume better evidence will come. Because if you're doing that, you're essentially using, well, frankly, a science of the gaps. We don't know yet, so we're assuming science will fill that in and basically putting faith into that. Are we willing to do that? Is that reasonable? Or is there a bias in the mix that is keeping you from appealing to a supernatural explanation? Something had to cause this. What was it? Another claim that tends to get brought up here a lot, popularized by guys like Carl Sagan. The claim is extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Seems reasonable, right? Like, if I'm going to make such a bold claim as there is a God who performs miracles and created everything, I better have some pretty extraordinary evidence for that extraordinary claim, right? Well, my first question is simply, why? Why? Why do extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence? What does that actually mean? What is this kind of arbitrary standard you are forcing onto this? What do you mean by extraordinary? Like, is this your way of saying, the only way I could believe in God is if I had a supernatural encounter with him? He better write his name in the sky in front of me, or we discover in DNA a signature, this is by God? Because if you saw that, would you actually say, okay, God exists, or would you then go see a psychiatrist or think that, this was a hoax? Are you really willing to believe that? So what is extraordinary to you? And why do these claims need that evidence? I mean, for one, the claim that God exists is, I think, less extraordinary than they realize, considering the vast majority of humans in the entire history of the world have believed that claim, and atheism has always been in the vast, vast, vast minority. But even then, an extraordinary claim doesn't require extraordinary evidence. It requires evidence. If there is a God and miracles are possible, what is the evidence for that claim? That's why I spent the time for the resurrection looking at what is the historical evidence around this. Because that evidence is just that. It's evidence. I don't need to have a divinely written message in the sky that Jesus rose from the dead. I need to examine the evidence that's there. Anything else is just admitting a bias. So there's one last thing before we wrap this up I want to do, and just to say, we have this sense that there is a conflict between faith and science, that science and religion do not mix. And frankly, that's just not true historically. That's a fairly recent concept. In fact, many of the most significant and influential scientists in history were devout theists. Think about Sir Francis Bacon. He's the guy who invented the scientific method. He gave this entire scientific enterprise, basically. And he was a devout Anglican. He said knowledge is the rich storehouse for the glory of the Creator and the relief of man's estate. Basically, he's saying science is there to study God. And that's what a lot of these people believe. That they believe the universe was orderly. That there could be understanding within that. It made sense from a Christian worldview. Look at Robert Boyle. He's the father of modern chemistry, still very influential and significant in chemistry textbooks today. And he said that a deeper understanding of science was a higher glorification of God. He studied science to glorify God. Doesn't seem like they don't mix very well in his perspective. Okay, what about Isaac Newton? Everyone loves Sir Isaac Newton. Well, maybe not everyone if you had to actually study calculus. But yeah, invented calculus, discovered the law of universal gravitation, one of the greatest physicists ever in history. Yet, he was a Protestant who spent more time studying the Bible and theology than science. Yeah, he was a great scientist, but he loved theology. Now, I should also mention, I don't agree with all these guys on every theological concept, and some of their status as, Orthodox Christianity might be dubious, but just to say, they did not see a conflict between their devout religious beliefs and their scientific study. Gregor Mendel, he's the founder of the science of genetics. So if you've ever had you remember the boxes with the letters when you're studying genetics and pea plants? That was all this guy. He gave us that. And yet he was also a Roman Catholic friar and abbot. So very, very devout Catholic. Last one I want to bring up here is the most recent of these, is Sir William Lawrence Bragg. He won the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1915 for discovering X-ray crystallography. And I think his quote just summarizes this whole issue so perfectly. From religion comes a man's purpose, from science his power to achieve it. Sometimes people ask if religion and science are not opposed to one another. They are, in the sense that the thumb and the fingers of the hand are opposed to one another. It is an opposition by means of which anything can be grasped. They're not opposed to each other, as in you can't have science and faith at the same time. You don't need to turn off your scientist brain when you go to church on Sunday, and then turn the faith brain off and your scientist brain on when you go to work during the week. They can be mixed together very, very well, and history shows us that perfectly. The idea that you can't be a rational scientist and believe in God, that's a recent dilemma that, frankly, is illegitimate. It's like what John Lennox said. Just because a scientist says something doesn't automatically make it true. They are subject to their philosophical biases just as much as we are. And we need to recognize that. So that's a few evidences for God. There's obviously more of these. I think are some of the strongest and some of the more robust. But we could spend hours and hours going through all of these. I hope this was something interesting and meaningful to you. Next week, we'll get into one more evidence for God, but it's a little bit different than these and relevant to our topic for next week. So next week, going to be all about evil and suffering. Hope to see you there.